policy events, and every weekend the latest nonfiction authors and books on Book TV. You can see past programs and get our schedules at our websites, and you can join in the conversation on social media sites.
The U.S. Senate is about to gavel in to continue work on the immigration bill. The measure creates a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants and allows additional high and low-skilled workers. Yet, urge amendment to double border guards and the fencing along the southern border. The Senate will vote tomorrow on including those provisions in the immigration bill. A number of other amendments are awaiting action. Bill managers continue negotiations over which to bring to the floor for votes, and votes on
The Senate will come to order, and the chaplain, retired Admiral Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Holy God, from whom alone all good proceeds, let the graces of faith, hope, and love be felt today on Capitol Hill. Lord, you rule all things by your wisdom. May our lawmakers, therefore, look to you for guidance and strive to manifest complete subservience to your will. Continue to shower our senators and their loved ones with your daily mercies as they grow in grace and true holiness throughout the seasons of their lives. May they show their love for you by loving others as you have loved humankind. Help them to continue to expect great things from you as they continue to attempt great things for you. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Majority Leader.
Following Lee remarks, the Senate will be in printing morning business for an hour. The majority will control the first half, Republicans the final half. Following that morning business, the Senate will resume consideration S-744, the immigration bill. I now ask unanimous consent the filing deadline for first-degree amendments to S-744 be 12 p.m. today.
Without objection, so ordered.
The filing deadline for all first-degree amendments, both substitute amendment and the bill, is today at noon. The Senate will recess today from 12:30 to 2:15 for weekly caucus meetings. Senators will be notified when votes are scheduled. I would note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, law enforcement officials who made the arrests and looked at this called it a modern-day plantation. What happened is a string of very profitable convenience stores. They had undocumented immigrants from Pakistan and Philippines routinely working up to 100 hours a week for very, very below minimum wage. And although their employers made $180 million over a dozen years while pocketing much of their employees' wages, these workers lived packed into apartments unfit for human habitation. But because they lacked the proper immigration paperwork, the workers were simply too afraid to speak up for themselves. Happens all the time. These were the circumstances at more than a dozen 7-Eleven stores in Long Island, New York, and in Virginia. They were raided last week by federal immigration officials. But the unfortunate conditions exposed by this high-profile bust are all too common. The busts don't come very often. They were able to get to the bottom of this. Most of the time, these people are so abused and nothing happens, except the abuse continues. More than 1/2 of undocumented day laborers say they've been cheated by employers. 1/4 of undocumented workers polled in New Jersey say they've been assaulted by their employers, a crime they rarely report. A lot of times they have language barriers, and they're simply afraid they're going to lose their job and maybe be deported. And in one survey, virtually every undocumented female farm worker said sexual violence in the workplace is a very serious problem. The 11 million people living in America without the proper documentation are particularly vulnerable to abuse by these employers who are very unscrupulous. A system under which people can be forced to live as indentured servants under substandard living conditions and the threat of violence hurts all workers and is wrong. It's immoral. The bipartisan immigration bill before the Senate will eliminate the kind of exploitation seen at these rogue 7-Eleven stores and other dishonest employers in a number of ways. First, it will reduce illegal immigration by strengthening our borders and fixing our broken legal immigration system. We all acknowledge before going into this debate that our system was broken and needed to be fixed. That's what this bill does. The bill will also make the electronic employment verification system known as E-Verify mandatory within 5 years. That will make it virtually impossible for people without the proper immigration paperwork to secure jobs, removing the incentive to come here illegally, and removing the incentive from these unscrupulous employers of taking advantage of these people. The legislation will allow temporary workers to change jobs without losing their visas, making it possible for them to escape and report exploitive employers without fear of deportation. They haven't been able to do that. They won't until we pass this legislation. This measure also offers more visas for victims of crime, including employer abuse. These protections will be good for honest workers, helping them stand up for the rights without fear of retribution. And they'll be good for honest employers whose unscrupulous competitors have an unfair advantage. This legislation also recognizes that undocumented workers play an important role in our economy and need an earned pathway from the shadows to citizenship. The path won't be easy. It wasn't intended to be. Undocumented people will have to go to the back of the line, pay penalties and fines, work, pay taxes. They'll have to work, pay taxes, learn English, and stay out of trouble. Mr. President, the alternative to deport 11 million people is impractical, inhumane, and just plain wrong for our economy. Helping millions of immigrants get right with the law will boost our national economy by more than $800 billion over the next 10 years. And it will reduce the deficit by almost $1 trillion over the next 2 decades. Pretty good deal. Last night's strong bipartisan vote on the Corker-Hoven Border Security Compromise was a huge step forward for this legislation. Opponents of immigration reform can no longer hide behind false concerns about border security. And that's an understatement, Mr. President. It can't be an excuse to oppose immigration reform. If it is, it's really transparently obvious that they're just trying to figure out a way to vote against this legislation. I hope those who have stood in the way of this legislation will instead join us to do the right thing for our economy and the humane thing for immigrant families. It's really time to crack down on crooked employers, and that's what they are, who exploit and abuse undocumented immigrants. And it's time to give hope to 11 million immigrants who want nothing more than to become citizens of the place they call home.
Mr. President, the Republican leader. In advance of the President's big speech today, I read this morning that one of the White House climate advisors finally admitted something most of us have suspected all along. He said, quote, "A war on coal is exactly what's needed. A war on coal is exactly what's needed." That's one of the President's advisors. It's an astonishing bit of honesty from someone that close to the White House. But it really encapsulates the attitude this administration holds in regard to states like mine, where coal is such an important part of the economic well-being of so many middle-class families. And it captures the attitude it holds with regard to middle-class Americans all across the country, where affordable energy is critical to the operation of so many companies and small businesses, and to those businesses' ability to hire Americans and help build a ladder to the middle class for their families. Declaring a war on coal is tantamount to declaring a war on jobs. It's tantamount to kicking the ladder out from beneath the feet of many Americans struggling in today's economy. And I'll be raising this issue with the President at the White House later today. One of the sectors the President's war on jobs would hit is manufacturing. Ironic, perhaps, because just a few months ago it was President Obama himself who said, "I believe in manufacturing. I think it makes our country stronger." Well, of course, that's correct. Manufacturing does make our country stronger. Just look at Kentucky. We're the first in the nation in aluminum smelting. We're third in the production of auto parts. And Kentuckians know these types of businesses strengthen not just the bluegrass state, but our entire nation. They provide well-paying jobs, economic growth, and tickets to prosperity for workers and their families. And yet, in the global economy of the 21st century, retaining, much less expanding, our manufacturing core has never been more challenging than it is now. We face relentless competition from all corners of the globe. So policymakers have to be careful about the types of policies they enact. Obviously, American success in this hyper-competitive world is strengthened when we keep taxes low and regulations smart. And perhaps most importantly, it's strengthened when we ensure energy is abundant and affordable. These are energy-intensive industries, after all. If the White House moves forward with this war on jobs and raises the cost of energy, that would almost assuredly raise the cost of doing business. And that would likely put jobs, growth, and the future of American manufacturing at risk. That's one of the many reasons why Americans rejected the President's attempt to impose a national energy tax in his first term. Even with overwhelming majorities in Congress, including a filibuster-proof 60-vote majority in the Senate, Washington Democrats were unable to pass the President's energy tax. Here in the Senate, the Democratic majority wouldn't even bring it up for a vote. Think about that. They could have pushed it through on their own without a single Republican vote, and yet they couldn't. Why? Well, for one, the constituents we serve are a lot smarter than some here in Washington might like to believe. They know you can't impose a national energy tax without cutting jobs and significantly raising energy costs, not just on their families, but also on their employers. And the data seem to bear out such concerns. I remember some projections showing that by 2030, the Waxman-Markey proposal could have decreased the size of our economy by about $350 billion and reduced net employment by 2.5 million jobs, even after taking job creation into account. So Americans made their opposition to this tax abundantly clear to members of Congress. And in the 2010 midterm elections, they ousted a good number of those who voted for it in the House. And because of concerns about job losses, higher utility bills, and reduced competitiveness, Congress today is even less inclined to vote for an energy tax than when the President commanded such massive majorities in the first part of his first term. It's fairly self-evident to say there is no majority for such an idea in the 113th Congress. But the President still wants to push ahead and ignore the will of the legislative branch, the branch closest to the people. Whether the American people want it or not, he says he'll do it by presidential fiat. By presidential fiat. I'm sure we'll find out more details in his speech later today, but if I'm right, and I think I am, he's going to lay out a plan to do what he wants to do through executive action. In other words, more czars, more unaccountable bureaucrats. The message this sends should worry anyone who cares about constitutional self-government, that the President can simply ignore the will of the representatives sent here by the people because he wants to, because special interests are lobbying him, because he wants to appease some far-left segment of his base. Well, what I'm saying is this. He cannot declare a war on jobs, and simultaneously claim to care about manufacturing. And he cannot claim to care about states like mine, where an energy tax would do great damage to countless Americans employed in energy sectors like coal. Look, for many, wages are already failing to keep pace with rising costs. For many people already. Many families have seen their real median income actually decline in recent years. And a survey released yesterday showed that 3/4 of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. This is the reality of the Obama economy. Even in the best of times, imposing an energy tax would be a bad idea. But in an era of unacceptably high unemployment, an era where Americans are desperate for the President to finally focus on growing the middle class rather than throwing scraps to his wealthy supporters, ideas like this border on self-defeatingly absurd. Absurd. He may as well call his plan what it is, a plan to ship jobs overseas. Basically, it's unilateral economic surrender. And to what end? To what end? Many experts agree that a climate policy that does not include massive energy consumers like China and India is essentially meaningless. Meaningless. But the damage to our economy would be anything but meaningless. And ironically, those are the very types of countries that stand to benefit economically from our loss. So nations like these will probably just take our jobs, keep pumping more and more carbon into the air, and what will we have to show for it? What will we have to show for it? That's a question the President needs to answer today. Americans want common sense policies to make energy cleaner and more affordable. The operative phrase being common sense, because Americans are also deeply concerned about jobs and the economy. That's what the President should be focused on. Incredibly, it appears to be the furthest thing from his mind. Now, Mr. President, I have been mentioning on a daily basis the ongoing concern I have about the institution in which 100 of us serve, an institution that served America well since the beginning of our country, when the Constitution was framed back in 1787. George Washington presided over that Constitutional Convention. Legend has it that he was asked, "What do you think the Senate is going to be like?" He reportedly replied that it would be like the saucer under the teacup, and the tea that sloshed out of the cup would go down into the saucer and cool off. In other words, the founders of our great country believed that the Senate would be a place where things slowed down, were thought over, and obviously where bipartisan agreements would be the way to move forward. And over the period of our history, the idea of unlimited debate has had a lot of support in this body from both parties. Back during World War I, it was agreed that there ought to be some way to stop a debate. Prior to that, there was no way, actually, to stop a debate. And they agreed to create a device called cloture that would allow a supermajority of the Senate to bring debate to an end. And over the years, there have been flirtations by majorities of different parties to fundamentally change the Senate. And those temptations have been avoided. Those temptations arose again at the beginning of the previous Congress and at the beginning of this Congress under the current majority and the current majority leader. And there was a lot of discussion about the way forward for the institution that would benefit the institution and not penalize either side. In January of 2011, the majority leader said the issue was settled for the next two Congresses, the previous Congress and this one. In spite of that, we entered into a lengthy discussion at the beginning of this Congress on a bipartisan basis, and as a result of that, the Senate passed two rules changes and two standing orders, and the majority leader once again gave his word that this issue was concluded. Just this last January, I asked the majority, the majority leader, I said I would confirm with the majority leader that the Senate would not consider other resolutions relating to any standing order of the rules this Congress unless they went through the regular order process. And the majority leader said that is correct. Any other resolutions related to Senate procedure would be subject to a regular order process, including consideration by the Rules Committee. Now, the regular order process, Mr. President, is it takes 67 votes to change the rules of the Senate. We did that with the two rules changes earlier this year, thereby confirming again that's the way you change the rules of the Senate. But the majority leader, in spite of having given his word, not once but twice, continues to suggest that that may not be a word that's going to be kept, and has continued to flirt openly with employing what is called the nuclear option. Now, my party, when it was in the majority some time ago, eight or 9 years ago, flirted with it as well, but good sense prevailed, and we moved backward. And we moved into a position where we are today, which is that it takes 60 votes when you have a determined minority to get an outcome. Now, the threat has been related to nominations, and nominations only, as if somehow breaking the rules of the Senate, to change the rules of the Senate, would be confined to nominations in the future. The way that would be done, of course, is the parliamentarian would say that it was a violation of the Senate rules to change the rules of the Senate with 51 votes. The majority would simply appeal the ruling of the chair and do it with 51 votes. If that is ever done, Mr. President, the Senate as an institution that we have known is finished. And it would not be confined to nominations in the future. And Senator Alexander and I laid out a few days ago the kind of agenda that we would probably pursue, almost certainly pursue, were we in the majority. And it was an agenda, I think, that would, in many respects, horrify the current majority. Such things as completing Yucca Mountain, such things as repealing Obamacare, such things as national right to work. I mean, things that I believe probably every single member of the majority party would find abhorrent. But that's the point. The supermajority threshold is inconvenient to majorities from time to time. It requires them to engage in negotiation in order to go forward. And it's frustrating from time to time. But it's important to remember, I think, every Senate majority should remember that the shoe will someday be on the other foot. And that the institution has served our country well. We've had some big debates this year in which we've had amendments and discussions on a bipartisan basis, and bills move forward. We saw it on the Farm Bill. We've seen it on other bills. We may well see it on the bill that's on the floor of the Senate now. But the fundamental point before the Senate is we need to know if the majority leader intends to keep his word. Because in the Senate, your word is important. In fact, it's the currency of the realm here in the Senate. And so I'm going to continue to raise this issue because we need to resolve it. The senators need to know that word will be kept. A word on the ground rules on how we operate here in the Senate needs to be kept. And we are not interested in a majority that says the definition of advise and consent is sit down and shut up. Do things that I want to do when I want to do it, or I'll threaten to break the rules of the Senate to change the rules of the Senate. This is no small matter, and I'll continue to address it until we get it resolved. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the majority controlling the first half.
Mr. President.
The Assistant Majority Leader.
Mr. President, in deference to the presiding officer, I'm going to forego my speech on the Stanley Cup playoffs until another member is presiding later in the day. Instead, I would like to address the speech just made by the Republican Senate leader on the issue of our environment. Senator McConnell of Kentucky comes and tells us that if we are going to discuss the state of our environment in America, it is a war on coal and a war on jobs. I think he's wrong. I think the Republican approach to the environmental issues is a war on science. It is denial of the overwhelming scientific evidence that the weather affecting us on this earth is changing. We know it. Storms, extraordinary storms, are more frequent and more violent than they have been. We know that the polar ice cap is melting. We know the glaciers are disappearing. We know the impact this will have on humanity as well as wildlife. And yet, from the other side, complete denial of science. This is a war on science. Their position is also a war on public health. 30 million Americans suffer from asthma. It is the #1 reported cause of children being taken to the emergency room in America, asthma. And to ignore the state of air pollution and the public health challenges that it presents is to ignore the reality of the state of our environment and its impact on public health. And finally, the Republican approach when it comes to this issue is a war on this earth that we call home. Unless and until the United States shows leadership when it comes to the environment, it is difficult, if not impossible, to convince other nations to do the same. Today, the President's going to make a speech which will be controversial about what to do with our environment. But I think he's on the right track to engage us in a national debate, a debate about the legacy we leave our children and grandchildren when it comes to this earth that we live on. Senator McConnell's state of Kentucky is just south of mine. He has coal reserves in his state. So do we in Illinois. And we've seen those reserves, because of some of the contamination and chemicals that are associated with that coal, diminish dramatically over the last several decades. I haven't given up on coal if it is used responsibly. This administration has invested in clean coal projects, and let me tell you one. It's called Future Gen 2. It is a project to capture the emissions coming out of smokestacks from coal-fired electric power plants and to bury them deep beneath the earth, a mile beneath the earth. It is capture and sequestration of these emissions. It's an energy research experiment which we are engaged in right now in central Illinois, which I believe holds promise for the use of coal in the future in a much more responsible way. Well, how much can you store below the earth in central Illinois? We can store the emissions of 50 electric power plants fueled by coal for 50 years. Let's engage in that research. Let's find responsible ways to use coal. And this notion that moving toward energy efficiency and reducing pollution is going to cost us jobs just isn't borne out by the evidence. We are seeing dramatic investments being made in manufacturing for solar and wind and geothermal. We are seeing dramatic investments creating new American jobs because we are setting new standards for more fuel-efficient cars, for example. That's good for every family, every business in America. It's good for the environment, and it creates jobs. So to suggest that dealing with the environment costs us jobs, exactly the opposite is true. Let me also say a word about the Republican leader's concern about working families living paycheck to paycheck. Time and again, on this side of the aisle, we have offered to that senator and his colleagues a chance to reduce the tax burden on working families in America by asking those who are doing quite well to pay a little more, and they have consistently said no. Time and again, we have asked the Republican leader and his colleagues to join us in raising the minimum wage, and they have said no. So this concern about families struggling paycheck to paycheck should be borne out by some of their votes. That, to me, is essential. Let me close by saying this. I believe that the environment is a challenge we must face head-on. To ignore it is to ignore reality. Lake Michigan, when measured just a few weeks ago, was at its lowest depth in any measured time in recent history. What we're seeing in global warming is the evaporation of our Great Lakes. It's a scary thing to think about what this will ultimately do to us. The President is going to face the issue head-on. There are some who want to run away from it. They can do that if they wish. But their war on science, their war on health, their war on those destructive forces that are affecting this earth is short-sighted. We need leadership on this, bipartisan leadership. Mr. President, let me close by saying I'm going to yield to my friend from Maryland. I'm going to come back shortly after morning business to speak about this historic immigration bill. The 67-27 vote on the floor last night, bipartisan vote, is an indication that we have finally come up with an historic measure, one that's important for the future of this nation. We'll do many things around here, and important things, but hardly anything as important as fixing this broken immigration system. The fact that we can do this in the Senate on a bipartisan basis is a tribute to this institution getting back on its feet and putting aside some of the political battles of the past. I only hope that our friends over in the House are watching this and understanding that only through bipartisanship can we really cure and solve some of the problems our nation faces. Now I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Before my friend from Illinois leaves the floor, I just want to congratulate you on your incredible leadership on the immigration bill. You brought many issues to the compromise that was reached, but I particularly want to thank you on behalf of the children. The DREAM Act that is incorporated in this legislation that will help so many young people. I told the story on the floor of the Senate about a person who lives in Maryland who was offered a scholarship and had to turn it down when he found out he didn't have legal status here in the United States. What a disappointment it was to him. I also told about a lot of other young people who have had the courage now to step forward, and your legislation will give them hope in a very relatively short period of time to really be able to accomplish the dream of being here in America. And I just want to applaud you. I want to applaud all the senators who were involved. Senator Schumer just left the floor. His incredible work, Senator Bennett, Senator Menendez, the Republicans you work with, Senator McCain, Senator Graham, Senator Flake, and Senator Rubio. You're absolutely right. If we're going to get a major bill done, it has to be done in a bipartisan way. It's not the bill you would have written. It's not the bill I would have written. But you've done, I think, a great service to this country. Thank you. Mr. President, I would ask I have 8 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have been approved by the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
And Mr. President, I've also cleared with our side. I ask consent to speak to up to 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, yesterday was good news. It was good news on behalf of the passage of S-744, the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill. This is good news that the Senate is on the verge of being able to act on this legislation. 11 million people who live in the shadows, they will now have hope that they will be able to stay here in America and work in America and one day become citizens of this great country. But the real winners of immigration reform are the American people and our government. We have a broken immigration system today, and this bill will allow us to replace that broken immigration system with a balanced approach on how to deal with immigration in this country. It's balanced by first recognizing border security is important. We have to make sure that people come into this country lawfully, come in through a door, not over a fence, and this bill clearly deals with the issues of border security. It also deals with E-Verify for employers to make sure employers only hire those who are legally present in this country. And it also provides a way in which those who are currently here can come out of the shadows, get legal status, and earn the pathway to citizenship. I say earn a pathway to citizenship because those individuals have to comply with our laws, pay our taxes, learn English, and then, Mr. President, wait for the entire work backlog within the immigration system to be cured before they can apply for citizenship. So it's a way in which individuals who are currently here, who are law-abiding, who are prepared to comply with our laws, have a reasonable pathway to citizenship. It also deals with realistic numbers for people who want to come to America, who want to make America their home, family reunifications, as well as those who want to work in this country by having reasonable numbers so that we can get the skilled workers we need, we can get the seasonal workers we need. And it replaces a badly broken immigration system. And as I mentioned to Senator Durbin, it includes the DREAM Act. So children who have been here most of their lives within a relatively short period of time have a pathway to citizenship here in America. Mr. President, I regret that the border surge modifications were added to this legislation. I do that for many reasons. I thought the bill reported out by the Judiciary Committee, although it was not the bill that I would have written, was well balanced on border protection. I think the additions that will be added later today will spend a lot of money with little results for the taxpayers of this country. I think we've thrown money at a problem rather than trying to look at what should be done in the most cost-effective way. The cost benefits of these billions of dollars that are being spent, to me, are very marginal. Most of the problems deal with employment. The E-Verify system, I think, is an important improvement in the bill, as reported out by the Judiciary Committee. And when we look at who is likely in the future to be illegal in this country, it's more likely to be people who entered the country lawfully and then are out of status than it is someone sneaking over the border. So I think we could have used the money in a much more effective way, and we are micromanaging border security, which in the long run will not be in the benefit of this country. I couldn't agree with Senator Leahy more in the statement that he gave. We are waiving contractor rules by the amendment that is currently on the floor, and that's going to cause waste, fraud, and abuse. There's no question in my mind about that. And what I find really hypocritical is that the same senators who are on the floor day after day complaining about the size of government and government spending when it comes to educating our children, when it comes to dealing with our most vulnerable, when it comes to dealing with our health care system, are the ones who propose spending more money on border security than anyone thought was necessary. So, to me, we could have done this better, and I am disappointed. And I think if you take a look at it, the amount of money that's being spent here exceeds any of the earmark funds that we were complained of wasting in the past. I thought there was some benefit to earmarks, and we talked about that. We got rid of earmarks, and now we have a bill that's spending billions of dollars in an effort to deal with border security when we could have done it in a much more cost-effective way. I'm also disappointed by the amendment process that has been used in this legislation. I don't blame the majority leader at all. What I do is blame those who have been obstructionists in considering amendments on the floor. Republicans have complained about amendments being offered on the floor of the Senate in the past. When given the opportunity on this immigration bill for us to consider amendments, it was the same Republicans who objected to us considering the bill. Senator Leahy offered a group of non-controversial amendments. Mr. President, it was a large group. Senator Landrieu has talked about this frequently. She offered her amendment to deal with children. In that group of non-controversial amendments was an amendment that I offered. I still hope we'll have a chance to deal with this, the Rush Act. Now, what does that deal with? That's Amendment 1286, bipartisan. pleased that Senator Kirk, Senator Portman have joined me in co-sponsoring this bill. This amendment. It deals with Holocaust survivors, some of our most vulnerable citizens. On average, they are over 80 years of age. Many live alone. Many live below the federal poverty level. And they are desperately concerned about being institutionalized, as I think everyone here can understand. This amendment makes it easier for them to access services under the Older Americans Act. Non-controversial, was before us, objected by a Republican why we couldn't offer that series of amendments. That's not what we should be doing. We should be considering these amendments in the orderly way. That was not allowed. Let me mention one other amendment I hope we'll get a chance to consider, S. 1469, offered by Senator McCain, and I've joined Senator McCain on this. It deals with gross violations of human rights, internationally recognized human rights. Someone who has violated the basic international standards for human rights shouldn't be given a visa to come here to America. We took action last Congress dealing with the Magnitsky circumstances in Russia, denying gross human rights violators in Russia the opportunity of coming to America and getting a visa. At that time, we talked about that should be an international standard. Senator McCain and I have led the charge on this, with other senators. I want to thank Senator Wicker for his work on these issues. We should now have the opportunities, non-controversial, no one's raised an objection to it, should be considered. And yet, because of the obstructionist policies, to date we have not had that opportunity. I want to mention a few other issues that are in the underlying bill that I think we could improve upon if we have the opportunity to consider reasonable amendments. One deals with profiling. I've introduced legislation that would ban profiling. When law enforcement profiles based upon race, religion, national origin, or ethnicity, it's bad police policy. It's bad law enforcement policy. It leads to sloppy work. It leads to waste of resources. And resources are very scarce. And it causes a community to turn against working with law enforcement rather than working with law enforcement. All of us have said we want to get rid of racial profiling, and yet this bill does provide a statement against profiling. But it is not as strong as it should be, and there's some unintended consequences as a result of the language that's included in it. I think this is very appropriate. I'm talking about this today as the Trayvon Martin case starts in our courts, the youngster who, as a result of racial profiling, lost his life. I've introduced an amendment, 1267, which would add to the basic bill against profiling based upon religion or national origin, and would remove a broad exception to the bill that is included here that's well intended, but I think really compromises the purpose of the underlying bill, which is to prevent profiling. I've also offered Amendment 1266, which deals with additional security scrutiny given and screening given to certain individuals. The underlying bill says it can be done by country or region. Well, that's profiling. If we have specific information, let's use specific information. Otherwise, again, we're going to be wasting the resources of our security system. The best use of resources would have us have information that we use for additional screening rather than just saying from one region or one country. And by the way, if you can get a visa from those countries, then there's obviously a reason for you to be here. Unless you have a specific reason for additional screening, we shouldn't be doing that by region or country. The two amendments I refer to are supported by many, many groups. They're supported by the Leadership Council on Civil and Human Rights, by the NAACP, by the ACLU, and I can mention other groups that have urged us to modify the underlying bill with these changes. I held several town hall meetings in Maryland on the immigration reform bill. They were well attended. I thought the discussions were very positive. They were focused on how we can make this bill a better bill and eliminate some of the unintended consequences. Several at these town hall meetings talked about the registered provisional immigrant status and certain requirements in order to stay in that status and have a pathway to citizenship. One is you have to be regularly employed. We understand that. That's a good requirement. However, there are times when you have to understand that may not be practical. During an economic downturn, when someone's in school, the bill recognizes that school is an acceptable, education is an acceptable substitute for regular employment. But if you're unemployed for a 60-day period, you run the risk of losing your legal status in this country. I offered an amendment that said volunteering and community service would be an acceptable substitute. Now, this is a win-win situation. Someone who volunteers, helping our community, also learning more about the needs of our community. This has the support of the AFL-CIO. They understand the reasonableness of our labor circumstances. And I would have hoped that we've had a chance, and I hope still we'll have a chance, to consider that modification. I also was in discussions dealing with, that came out of these town hall meetings, those who have violated our laws perhaps many years ago, maybe not a very serious issue. There should be at least some flexibility in the law for extenuating circumstances so someone's not jeopardized to be deported because of something that is not really relevant to today, that person be law-abiding. I would hope we could consider that. I offered Amendment 1264, which deals with private prisons. I think our colleagues were surprised to find out that ICE detentions, about 14,000, about half are detained in private penal facilities, not federal facilities. Now, we want accountability. This law provides for accountability for those who are detained. But a FOIA application where you can get information only applies to federal prisons. It doesn't apply to the non-federal prisons. Well, I offered an amendment, a common sense amendment, I don't think it's controversial, that would apply the same oversight to non-federal prisons, to private prisons, as we do to federal prisons. We all talk about accountability and responsibility of accountability. I think that amendment makes abundant sense. So as you can see, this is not the bill I would have drafted. I would have done other things. I would have spent money a little bit differently than it's spent here, certainly not as much money. I would have taken care of some of the problems on profiling, so certainly would have done with the Holocaust survivors, some of the other issues. And I still have hope that some of these amendments can be considered and adopted. I know people are working on that, and I hope we can work on a package that will improve the bill, particularly the non-controversial amendments. I spoke on the floor a couple weeks ago as to why I supported this bill. I talked about a high school student who found out he was eligible for a scholarship only to find out he couldn't take it because of his legal status. I talked about young people who are separated from their parents who have been deported. I've talked about employers who have workers that are well-trained, seasonal needs, highly skilled needs, scientists who are desperate for immigration reform so that they can meet their economic needs. I've talked at great length how this bill will help the American economy, help us be more competitive internationally, and how this bill is compassionate as to what America should stand for on its immigration policies. So, Mr. President, this is not a difficult choice for me to make. I support this legislation and will be voting for this legislation because I do think it's in the best interest of our country. I do hope we have an opportunity to improve this legislation before we vote on it. I hope we can adopt some of these non-controversial amendments. But I do hope that we will send this bill to the House of Representatives. I urge my colleagues in the House to follow the example of the Senate, to listen to each other, work across party line, so that we can pass comprehensive immigration reform, send it to the President of the United States for his signature. And with that, Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
I would ask consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
And Mr. President, I would ask that during quorum calls the time be equally charged to the majority and to the Republicans.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate continuing work today on the immigration bill. The measure creates a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants and allows additional high and low-skilled workers. Yesterday, the Senate voted to move forward with what's being called the Border Surge Amendment, and that's to double border guards and the fencing along the southern border. The Senate will vote tomorrow on including those provisions in the immigration bill. A number of other amendments are awaiting action. Bill managers continue negotiations over which to bring to the floor for votes, and votes on those brought to the floor could happen today. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid says he wants to finish the bill before senators leave for the 4th of July break. More on immigration now during this quorum call from a reporter.
We're joined by Alexander Bolton, senior staff writer for The Hill. Thanks for talking with us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
And the headline in The Hill of your story, immigration reform passes a key Senate test in a 67-27 vote. So Alexander Bolton, why is this a key test?
Because the amendment, the so-called Border Surge Amendment, which will add $38 billion for border security spending, was arranged so that it was woven into the entire bill. The entire amendment was 1,200 pages long, nearly 1,200 pages long. So if you're voting for this amendment, you're pretty much voting for the bill. And if you voted for the amendment last night, it's going to be pretty tough to vote against final passage later this week. So the people who voted for this Corker-Hoeven-Leahy proposal pretty much voted for the bill. So we have a pretty solid roadmap of how the yes votes are going to play out.
And Corker-Hoven, two of those names, Republicans. Why was their authorship of the amendment significant, and who were they able to bring on board in their own party?
Well, their authorship was significant because it addressed the biggest concern Republicans had about this bill, which is that it would grant a pathway to citizenship to millions of illegal immigrants before securing the border. And Corker and Hoven tried to address that by doubling the number of Border Patrol agents along the U.S.-Mexico border, authorizing the construction of 700 miles of fencing, putting forward all this money to pay for drones and other types of surveillance technology. And the head of Customs and Border Protection told John McCain, or the head of Border Patrol told John McCain that this would meet the security benchmark that the authors of the bill have always talked about, which is 100% situational awareness along the southern border and a 90% apprehension rate of illegal immigrants. And so that gave cover to a bunch of Republicans to sign on. Dean Heller of Nevada, Mark Kirk of Illinois, Roger Wicker of Mississippi was one of those votes that we saw last night. We weren't sure where he was going to be beforehand. And the amendment also included language to restrict benefits going to illegal immigrants or immigrants who would be receiving a registered provisional status. And so that secured the vote of Orrin Hatch, who voted for the bill in committee, but he wouldn't guarantee a vote for it on final passage because he said he still had concerns about these benefit issues. Well, it seems like his concerns on the benefit front have been assuaged by the Corker-Hoven amendment.
Alexander Bolton, we looked at a headline a moment ago in the Washington Times that said that as this bill advances, it's exposing a Republican rift in the Senate. So tell us about the Republican senators who are not supporting this legislation, and how significant are their voices right now?
Well, the Republicans who are opposing this legislation, such as Mitch McConnell, say that while this bill now will spend around $46 billion on border security, they say it doesn't guarantee anything. And so it goes to what is the deep distrust of Washington and the federal government among Republicans and among their Republican base around the country. And so they say, while you may spend a lot of money on the border, we're not going to vote for any amendment unless, or we're not going to vote for this bill unless it guarantees that there's going to be full operational control of the U.S.-Mexico border before provisional legal status is granted to millions of people.
I rise today to speak about long-standing rules, procedures, and traditions of the United States Senate. I have watched with interest over the past few weeks as members of the majority have continued to threaten to break the Senate rules in order to impose a majority rule at the expense of minority rights. We continue to hear threats of the nuclear option by which the majority would break the rules to change the rules. Despite past assurances from the majority that rules changes would only occur through regular order, they continue to threaten the exact opposite. Make no mistake, this is not some inside-the-beltway squabble over parliamentary procedure. The long-standing rules allowing for unlimited debate and amendment protect every American whose voice is represented by the minority in the United States Senate. These protections are especially important for Americans who live in rural and less populated states. That would include my home state of Nebraska. The Constitution specifically designed the Senate to function in a manner that was very different and very distinct from the House of Representatives. The threat of the nuclear option clearly abandons this intent. The majority leader has affirmed the importance of filibuster rights to small states, arguing they are, quote, a unique privilege that serves to aid small states from being trampled by the desires of the larger states, unquote. I continue to be astounded by the insistence by some that we trample over these rights. especially given the significant nominations and legislation the Senate has recently considered. It has been noted by many metrics the Senate has more rapidly confirmed President Obama's federal judicial nominations than it did during the time of President Bush's administration. In addition, over the past few months, the Senate has passed significant pieces of legislation: the Farm Bill, the Water Resources Development Act, and the Marketplace Fairness Act. We have considered bills I have supported and bills I have opposed, but the fact is we have given these pieces of legislation due consideration that would be required of the world's greatest deliberative body. At the beginning of this Congress, the Senate agreed to a new standing order to expedite Senate consideration in extraordinary circumstances. But the Majority Leader has not even attempted to use the expedited procedures, not once. So I ask, why then threaten the very fabric of how this institution was created? I have served in the Senate just 4 years, all of which I have been a member of the minority. Mr. President, I would caution my colleagues whose experiences have been conversely limited serving only in the majority. Should the majority go down the road of the nuclear option, then there is no turning back. And there will come a day, perhaps soon, when control of this chamber will shift and the current majority will not like what it sees when it is in the minority. My colleague, the senior senator from Tennessee, recently outlined a number of priorities he would pursue should we find ourselves in that situation where a Republican-controlled Senate could use majority rule. Now, I'm not going to be here in the 114th Congress, but I thought I would outline some policies I would support should the current majority take us down that road. Perhaps my list of priorities will give some ideas to my colleagues who will be serving in the next Congress. Here are just a few policies that I would highlight, many of which have already received majority support in the Senate, but have fallen short of the 60-vote threshold. First, and most importantly, the repeal of the health care law that promised everybody but delivered only chaos, confusion, and higher costs. You can bet the Senate would repeal all 2,700 pages with one 15-minute roll call vote. In addition, without having to worry about the opposition of the current majority, we could enact responsible reforms to rein in debt and deficit. Reforming our entitlements would, of course, need to be center stage. That's where the money is spent. Another priority would be to prevent regulatory overreach by heavy-handed executive agencies such as the EPA. Very specifically, we could overturn the EPA's pursuit of cap-and-trade through the regulatory process just announced today by the President, and force EPA to back off regulations with more cost than benefit. Next, we would promote investment and job growth by immediately approving the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. We could further support energy independence by continuing development of the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository, which has been stalled by the Majority Leader despite substantial support. This is critical to nuclear plants across this nation, including 2 plants in Nebraska. Another focus would be to provide transparency and reform the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I would require legislative oversight of its budget and replace the unelected head of the CFPB with an accountable board. Why stop there when we could just repeal the entirety of the Dodd-Frank Act and replace it with a more responsible approach? The Republican-controlled House of Representatives which the Senate would essentially mirror past 270 bills that the current majority leader declined to even consider last Congress. Should the current majority irrevocably alter the rules of the Senate, a new Senate majority could just railroad all 270 bills through the process. And all those treasured policies the majority puts in place will get repealed, perhaps before they ever get implemented. Ping-ponging from the whims of one two-year cycle to the next is not a way to govern. It's the very reason our founders designed a Senate as a counterweight to the House. I say to those colleagues who would so quickly disregard the Senate rules, be careful what you wish for. Under this approach, your procedural right to debate, to amend, to raise points of order, all of that would be useless. Your vote, your voice, the voice of your constituents would be effectively silenced. That is not the Senate that the framers envisioned when they brokered the agreement that established our constitutional approach. Mr. President, I leave you with the words of Senator Robert C. Byrd, with whom many of us had the pleasure of serving and whose love and knowledge of the United States Senate remain unsurpassed to this day. He said this: "The Senate has been the last fortress of minority rights and freedom of speech in the Republic for more than 2 centuries. I pray that senators will pause and reflect before ignoring that history and tradition in favor of the political priority of the moment," unquote. I hope the majority heeds his call to place history and tradition and our nation over the political priority of the moment. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President.